It's good to see you again. Yes, I am live. As you know, I wasn't here last week because Jim, my cat, bit my hand. My hand is better now. It was way worse last week. And I want to take a minute to say, if you get bitten by a cat, don't ignore it. Get medical help pretty quick. But I'm not a doctor, so so there you go. I'm just sharing information. I am, however, Becky Goldsmith, and I would like to welcome you to this week's Timeout. You can find me online at pieceocake.com. That's what it says down there at the bottom. And the quilt behind me is Bullseye Quilts. This is the 9-block quilt that's in the pattern pack. And it's been behind me before, but it's behind me again because I taught this as a class to the Denton Quilt Guild just a couple of days ago, and I haven't taken it down yet. Okay, today in this week's Timeout, I'm talking to you about needles. I got to tell you a story. I was at Joann's yesterday looking for a sashiko thimble because it's a kind of thimble I don't have, and I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. It's really a different needle. A different thimble. And the young woman in the store, maybe she was 18, I don't know, around that age, I said, can you tell me where the thimbles are? And she looked at me with a completely blank, above her mask, blank look in her eyes. And she said, say that again. I said, a thimble. I said, you wear them on your fingers. And she looked at me and she had to call for help. And she took me to the aisle where they were, where she would normally take me and show me where it was. But she didn't know what she was looking for. So I very nicely took a deep breath and said, okay, it's used in hand sewing. And perhaps you've never seen anyone sew by hand. And she had not, I don't think, because anyway, I explained what a thimble was, and she said, great, and we went on our merry way. And I'm sharing this with you because those of you who hand sew, and I'm mostly talking about hand sewing needles today, please do explain to people who might not know, who might be around you, what it is you're doing, and perhaps that you're using a needle that has thread through the eye, and that you might have a thimble on your hand and what it's for. We must pass on our knowledge, right? So this is so that was a side note entirely that I just had to share because all right, so here we go. The reason I'm talking about needles today is because Christina sent me an email and she had questions about needles. Specifically, how are they sized? What do the numbers on the packages mean? That's what I'm going to show you first. Do you remember when I talked about thread and the weight numbers and how they're assigned and that it's kind of confusing? Can I just say needle sizing is not really much better. I did write about needles just a little bit inside the thread guide. And one of the most confusing parts about needle sizing is the difference between sewing machine needles and hand sewing needles. In sewing machine needles, there are two numbers separated by a slash. The higher number is European, the smaller number is American. So here, that 70/10 that I can see pretty clearly, but you may not be able to, is European on the left and American on the right. And apparently long arm needles have 3 numbers, but I don't buy long arm needles, so I don't worry about that much. In sewing machine needles, the higher the number, the bigger the needle. So a 70/10 is smaller than a 116. Okay, got that? Higher the number, the bigger the needle. And if you have them right in front of you, that's very easy to see. In hand sewing needles, by contrast, the higher the number, the smaller the needle. Right there, my head just wants to melt down. But higher number, smaller needle. Hand sewing needles to me are more complicated because there are so many different kinds of needles and they vary by size depending on the kind of needle you're looking at. Inside the book, I list a variety of different kinds of needles and how you might use them. But for more detail on hand sewing needles, this is a really handy thing. Laura Wasilowski wrote it, and it's a pocket guide for hand sewing needles. It opens up, and these are the specialty needles that go with this picture. It's nice to have these, and I may own some of these needles, but I rarely use them. The real good information for me is on the inside. What's nice about this is that you can see the different kinds of needles, and the numbers below give you the size of that particular needle. What's interesting to me here is that applique needles are separated from sharps, and for that matter, from milliner's needles. There are needles that you buy that are labeled applique, but almost always, if you look close on the package, it will say whether it's a sharp. Does it always say if it's a milliner's needle? I don't run into that as often. Mostly, I just recognize that the vast majority of hand applique needles really are sharps. There's quilter's needles and milliner/straw needles, all different kinds of needles. Now, I'm going to move this around underneath the camera so that you can see they're pointy, and all of these needles have an eye for the thread to go through. But the shape of the eye, the size of the eye, the way the pointy end of the needle tapers, whether it's a long taper smoothly leading to the width of the eye, or a shorter taper so that it's pointy to go through the fabric and then it widens right out, that's important information. Okay, so why is that important information? It's because of mystery needles. If you don't have mystery needles, I'm really impressed. But Christina did and I do, because she said, can you size a solo existing needle that you love in order to buy a matching pack? Maybe you can and maybe you can't. Let me explain. Here we go. I've got a video. When confronted with a mess of needles that you don't know what they are, look first at the eye shape. And if you need to, refer back to the sewing needle guide. It's helpful. These big needles are chenille needles. I know because I pulled out some chenille needles and because they all have giant eyes. These two are 24s. Why do I know that? I know that because I pulled out size 24s. I know that one is a tulip and one is a Spargo needle, and they are subtly different, but they're so close to the same that when I put these up, I'm going to have to look closely at what's already in the package. This is a chenille needle as well. I know because I pulled it out. It's a John James 26 chenille. Finer because it's a higher number than the 24, and it is obviously a finer needle. This is a nice needle. I don't find myself needing to use it pretty much ever. Looking at the rest of these, I'm going to look at the eyes of the needle, and I think these are both embroidery needles. The eye of the needle is long, but it's not long like a chenille. And this needle, I know I pulled out a Bowen number 9 crewel needle. It's got to be that one. The funny thing about the number 9 crewel needle, I'm going to move those out of the way, is that it's about the same length as that number 26 chenille. And I know I got this one thinking that it would be easier to thread because it's got the longer eye. Turns out it's really not easier to thread. In fact, it's a little bit harder because the eye on this needle is a little bit tighter, which is why I don't use this very much. So that is my number 9 bow and crewel needle. And this one is a finer needle. And the other embroidery needle that I use a lot is Tulip's number 10 embroidery, which makes sense, higher number, finer needle. And you can tell that the eye of this needle is nowhere near as big as it is on the number 9 crewel embroidery needle. You'll sometimes see on packages crewel / embroidery, embroidery / crewel. They're the same kind of needle. Crewel is more for wool, but I don't know that it changes the nature of the needle that much. I really don't think it changes the nature of the needle at all, but I am not a needle specialist. Like, I haven't done a lot of research. I've done enough research to be reasonably sure that crewels and embroideries are the same. Now, one thing I want to be very clear about, and I'll probably say it again, needle sizes vary between companies. It's like thread. I don't know how they size needles. It's probably is not random, right? So thread weight sizes, the thread weight numbers, they are not assigned randomly, but there's more than one way that companies get to those numbers. As I said, I have not done the research, but my guess is that it's a similar kind of thing with needles, because if you've got the same kind of needle from different companies, they are not always the same. They're not identical. There's variations. So what do you do with that? Well, okay. You know, when I made that video and the next video and the one after that, I started with all my needles all neat and tidy, and I knew what they were. And by the time I got to the one I'm about to show you, I had lost all track of which one was which. So this is me doing what you might do if you are confronted with a bunch of needles that you kind of sort of know what they are, but you're not really sure what they are, but you might have an educated guess. Here we go. These are hand applique needles. Now there's two different kinds of needles that people use for hand applique. Some people like a milliner's needle. I personally skew toward sharps. So the bulk of these I know are sharps. See that giant needle right there? That's still a sharp. It has a rounder eye. The way the needle tapers is very sharp-like. Let's compare it to the crewel needle. See how the tapering is more abrupt from point to shaft in the chenille needle? It's a longer, smoother taper in a sharp. This is a big sharp. This is a number 7 made by Hemming & Sons. You can use this with pearl cotton, and some of you might like it maybe better than this needle. I have found that it's a little too thick, a little too long, a little too much for me, but some of you might like the number 7 sharp or a 9 sharp. You start getting into 10, 11, and 12 sharps, and you're into finer needles. And these, by and large, are going to be 11 and 12 sharps. This dark needle right here, I know that is a Clover Black Gold 12 sharp. This needle with the gold eye is Clover's Gold Eye applique needle. So these two needles are nearly the same, but one has plating that makes it a little sharper and more rigid, more expensive, less expensive. Both of these are nice needles. I have another needle with a gold eye but look how much bigger that is. It's still a fine needle, but it's so much longer than the 12s. And I know the only other thing for me that could be is the Super Glide made by Colonial. It's a size 11, has a gold eye. Notice how much longer that is. And then look at this other giant long needle. This is not a sharp. That is a milliner's needle. Milliner's needle resembles sharps, but they're a lot longer. If you like a longer needle in your invisible hand applique, that is not a bad choice. I'm going to move the milliner's needle out of the way. These are 12 sharps. That's an 11. That could be a 10 sharp. I know I pulled out 2 tulip number 11 sharps. That could be the difference. That could be the 10. Yeah, I just pulled one out of the package. That is a size 10 sharp from tulip, and these are size 11. Notice the difference in the length. So I think that must be what that is. Yep. So those are number 10 sharps, and these are 11s. And tulip does not go to a size 12 because they're already very fine. So the tulip 11 is just a hair longer than the number 12 sharp from Clover. I use these number 12s from Clover and 11s from Tulip all the time in my invisible hand applique. One of these days I may get to the place where I need a slightly longer needle. That's when I'll go to this one. That is the Super Glide in the size 11, Super Glide Gold Eye, because it's got a little more heft and a little more length. And if you've got hand issues coming up, that might be a good step up. And the number 10s are nice as well if you want a slightly bigger needle without going to the much longer milliner's needle. I hope you're still with me because needles, there's so many of them. And I remember a couple of weeks ago, I thinned out my needle stash. So it's relatively fresh in my mind what I've got, and of my mystery needles, what some of them might be. Here's some more. Here's some more in just a minute. Because, I know, I had a thing I needed to tell you. Besides just being for hand applique, milliner's needles and sharps are used for all other kinds of sewing as well. Lots of other kinds of sewing where you need needles that are just good sewing needles. Sharps are more common for that than milliner's needles. Okay, here we go. This next thing. Yes, let's do this. Here are 2 needles that are a little different. And if I didn't know what they were, I would guess they are sharps. But I know what they are because I just took them out of the package. They're both from Tulip. The one on the left is a sewing needle. That's what they call it. Now, I don't exactly know what kind of a needle a sewing needle is. It's not listed in the guide. I don't know. So that goes there. This needle that looks very similar is called a piecing needle. And I use this needle. I like it. When you look at them together, this one has the gold head, and that sets it apart a little bit. But the eyes are so much the same. The other difference between them is that the piecing needle is thicker. It does make it a little easier to hold in your hand and manipulate. A sharp at this length would be thicker. A milliner's needle would be longer. I wouldn't use these for hand applique at this time. I do use them for hand piecing and other kinds of hand sewing tasks. This one is sometimes the needle I use for English paper piecing. It's a nice needle, it's easy to manipulate. And if you have big hands or neuropathy, you might actually like this for applique. But when it comes to the question of how do you identify what kind of needle this is if you have no idea, I could look forever and not find this if I didn't know they were from Tulip, and the Tulip calls them one a sewing needle and one a piecing needle. If you're smart, you leave yourself notes in your needle caddy, and you are organized enough to put your needles back where they go. Sometimes I'm disorganized, and then sometimes I am not that organized. And when I look at these needles, I could now make an educated guess about where they go. And since I do have all my needles out right now, I probably will match these back into the packages where they go and vow never to do this again. If you watched the timeout session where I shared with you how to make these needle caddies, and I gave the idea to cut the papers that would fit in behind, this is an ideal way to keep up with what needles you've got, because ending up with a big bunch of needles that you like and you don't know what they are is really frustrating, and it's going to be time consuming to get these back for sure where they need to be. And that's the thing I'm going to do now off camera. And I did. I put those needles up. I did. And I tidied up my mystery needle stack here. And some of these I really do know where they go, and I should put them up, but I haven't done it yet because, gosh, it's hard. Which is why you should try your best to leave yourself notes. And my system with this needle caddy, it's functional, but it's really not very good. Honestly, I need to shift some of these to the other needle caddy where it's easier to make notes about what I've got. Both of these are free patterns at pieceofcake.com, so you can do that. Now, Barbara Castle kind of has a question about longer needles. So her dominant hand has a hard time manipulating the needles. That would be where you would look at either a larger size in the kind of needle you already sew with. So if you've got a sharp, say typically you might sew with a 12 or 11 sharp, which is pretty small, you could look up. But when you get too big in a sharp, they really are like sewing with toothpicks. So at that point, I would probably look at the sewing needles, the sewing or piecing needles, because they have a little more heft. And I got to thinking about this. I have gotten some packages of needles from Kohana, which is Japanese, and they are marked sewing needles. So maybe that sewing needle designation is more Japanese. Maybe? I don't know. This is me making it up because it's what I've run into. What else can you do if you've got bigger hands or neuropathy? Really, you just have to try a variety of different needles to see what works for you, and always keep the package and always make notes about where it came from. Now, the other question is, because this is important, because Christina asked, how long do needles last before they get dull? Mine last a really long time. Every now and then I'll notice a point that snags, and probably that's a needle I have been using for months, if not years, because I don't bend my needles. When you hold needles, different ways you can hold your needle, some ways promote needle bending. And if you get a needle that's bent too much, if you're a needle bender, you're going to go through needles more often, which means you're likely to go back to that original package more often, so you'll know more what it is you've been using. If you are like me and the needles aren't appreciably dull, they aren't bent, you use them until they're gone. And so for those of us who are like that, keeping up with what you've got is really important. What's my favorite needle for hand quilting? If I am doing traditional hand quilting, it would either be, both would be from Clover. Their size 12 quilting between, whether it is the black gold or just their straight up number 12 between, those would be the two I would use. If I get to the point where I need a bigger needle for traditional hand quilting, I would go to an 11. I think they make an 11. Sometimes needle sizes jump in even numbers or odd numbers. Really, it's crazy. What's the other thing? The other needle I like for hand quilting is for big stitch hand quilting. I've said this before. I really like the Bowen number 9 crewel needle. As a side note, next week I'm going to be talking about some embroidery. Don't get all excited. It's really simple embroidery, but it's embroidery embellishments. I'm not going to say more because I want you to be excited about coming next week. And I'm using Sashiko needles, at least for part of it. And Sashiko needles, I have come to understand, come in small and long, short and long styles. And if I was looking for another big stitch hand quilting needle, I would consider perhaps one of those Sashiko needles. So I hope that's helpful. Christina, I really appreciate you sending me those questions because it made me think about needles. It made me get my mind more or less together. It's helped me to think tidier thoughts about my needles. I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. And for anyone else who has questions that you would like me to answer in timeout, please do email me. I am really open to talking about all sorts of things. So there's my email address. You can get me at becky.pieceofcake@gmail.com. I have a lot of email addresses. You can actually also get me at becky@pieceofcake.com, just to complicate things. It is nearly 30 minutes, amazingly enough. So I appreciate you guys taking time this afternoon to join me. It's been a pleasure being back with you. And I will be here again next Wednesday at 2 o'clock Central Time, talking about a little bit of embroidery. And I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much. And until then, may you have many happy stitches.